I took a job as a night security guard for the old historical town, thinking it would be an easy gig. Established in the early 1800s, the town was a popular daytime attraction with its old homes, post office, grocery store, town hall, and jail still standing. My job was simple: keep an eye out for vandals and make sure no one trespassed after hours. Most nights, I'd sit in my car watching movies or playing games on my phone. It was usually boring, nothing ever happened. Until one night. I was in my car watching a movie when I thought I saw a flash of light near the old jail. I glanced up, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary, so I went back to my movie. A few minutes later, I saw the flash again. This time, it really caught my attention. I stopped the movie, grabbed my flashlight, and got out of the car, heading towards the jail. Assuming it was some kids trying to sneak in, I shined my light towards the building. When I arrived, everything seemed normal. I walked around the jail, but saw no one. Then, I heard a noise come from inside. I walked to one of the windows and shined the light in, catching a glimpse of someone quickly walking past. Assuming it was the kids that broke in, I yelled that they were trespassing and they needed to leave right now. I got no response. Knowing that I needed to get them out, I headed back to my car to get the keys that opened all of the buildings. Returning to the jail, I fumbled with the keys until I found the right one and unlocked the door. Inside, I walked to the cell area where I had seen the figure. I yelled out saying they needed to leave now or I would call the cops. Still, no response, and the jail area was quiet. I searched every corner, but found nothing. Frustrated, I yelled again that I was calling the cops. Still no response or sounds from anywhere. Suddenly, I felt a cold breath on my ear and heard a low, deep voice say, "Get out." I spun around, but there was no one there. Terrified, I bolted out of the jail, dropping the keys in my haste. I ran to my car, locking the car doors and staring at the jail's entrance, my heart pounding. Trying to rationalize, I convinced myself it must have been the kids playing a prank. But then I remembered I had dropped my keys. I had to go back. Pumping myself up, I got out of the car and approached the jail again, determined to show these kids I meant business. As I reached the door, I saw a dark shape just inside. Raising my flashlight, I saw the keys floating in the air behind a dark mass. Then, with a sudden force, the keys were thrown out of the door, and the door slammed shut. I screamed and ran back to my car, locking myself inside. I stayed there until morning, too scared to move. When the manager arrived, I told him my keys were in front of the jail, and that I quit. I never went back. I don't know what I saw that night, but it wasn't human. I wasn't a believer in ghosts before either, but I am now. I grew up in a small town. It was one of those towns you get stuck in. When I graduated high school, the first thing I did was move away. It was more than a decade later when I got the call that my mom was diagnosed with dementia. With me being the only child she had, and my father passing away when I was young, she had no one else to take care of her. I made the decision to move back to my hometown to take care of my mom. Moving her to the much bigger city I lived in would not have been good for her, so I swallowed my pride and went back home. I got moved in pretty smoothly, and my mom was happy to have me back home. Her doctors even commented on how much better she had been since I was back. I knew I'd be here for a while. I needed to find work that allowed me the flexibility to look after her. Just a block down the road from my mother's house was an old appliance repair shop. The owner, a man I knew from my younger years, Charlie, was more than happy to hire me and work around my schedule. A month after working with Charlie, things were going smoothly. I took a lot off Charlie's plate, and in return he was incredibly flexible with my hours and allowed me to spend time with my mom. One day, while swamped with repairs, I got a call from my mom. She was upset and needed me to come home. I told Charlie, and he told me to go home. He didn't say it, but I could tell me leaving added a lot of stress to his day. I hated leaving him like that, but I needed to be with my mom. I spent the next few hours with my mom, calming her down and making sure she was comfortable. When she finally went to bed, I figured I could head back to the shop and finish the work I had left undone. It was getting dark, but I figured I wouldn't have to worry about customers coming in and out, so I should be able to focus. I called Charlie to let him know I was going to the shop to finish up some of the jobs, but he insisted I leave it for tomorrow. I figured he was just worried about my mom. However, he had done so much for me, I wanted to return this small favor. I let myself into the shop and got to work. The main workspace was a large open room with benches along the walls. About an hour in, deep into a repair, the light bulb for the room went out. Thinking the bulb had blown, I grabbed a spare. I went back to the switch to turn it off before changing the bulb. Then I realized that the light switch was in the off position. I guess that I must not have flipped the switch all the way to on and it just slowly slipped back down to off. Shrugging my shoulders, I decided it was nothing and went back to work. About 15 minutes went by and I was lost in my task when the light went off again. This time, I immediately turned to the switch, half expecting to see someone, but no one was there. I walked over, flipped it back on, and called out thinking Charlie might have been playing a joke. There was no response. I walked around the shop looking to see if anyone was there, but nothing. Feeling a little uneasy, I wanted to finish my work and leave. I positioned myself so I could see the switch while working, glancing at it every few moments. One of the times I glanced over at the switch, something caught my eye. At first I didn't realize what I was looking at, but when I did, I screamed. I saw this bony hand with what looked to be rotting flesh falling off the bone, coming from the other side of the wall, and moving towards the light switch. My screaming had no effect on the hand's movement, and it slowly moved a bony finger on the light switch and flipped it off. Still screaming, I stumbled backwards and bolted out of the shop, locking the door behind me. I ran back home, locking my door and collapsing on the couch, trying to catch my breath. I had no idea what I had just seen, but it wasn't human. Not a living one anyway. The next day, I told Charlie everything. He just laughed, saying he had told me not to go there. He explained that he always left before sunset because of the strange things that happened. He didn't know what it was, but it liked to come out after dark. After that night, I never stepped foot in the shop after dark again. Some things are better left undisturbed. During high school, I wasn't what you would call the perfect student. I hung around people who weren't the best influence. We'd often skip school to smoke or cause trouble. One day that I'll never forget, we decided to check out an old abandoned school. It wasn't on any map, hidden through a small section of woods. It was me, Gabe, Rick, and Jason. While I hung out with a lot of different people, the four of us were pretty much inseparable. Gabe was the only one who had been there before, so we followed his lead. We met at my place and carpooled to a nearby church parking lot, the closest we could drive before setting out on foot. After about 10 minutes of walking, we entered into a clearing and saw the school. It was way bigger than I imagined. 4 stories tall and stretching hundreds of feet long. No trespassing signs were everywhere, but that only made it more thrilling for us. The windows and doors were boarded up, but Gabe knew of a window we could crawl through. We found it and carefully entered, avoiding the shards of glass. It was clear someone had broken into here before us. Once we got inside, we started exploring each floor. We walked through the various classrooms and hallways. There was graffiti and beer cans everywhere. After about an hour, we headed down to the first floor. Walking back to an area we had previously passed, Rick pointed at a door different from the others we had seen. We walked to the door. It looked like an elevator door. Rick and I pulled the doors apart, revealing we were correct. It was an elevator shaft. We looked down the shaft and it looked like it went down one more floor. Jason asked if the stairs we came down went down another level, but we agreed that it didn't. We agreed that it was weird that the only way to get down to this floor was through the elevator shaft. We discussed if we should go down or not, but while we were doing this, Gabe was already in the shaft tugging on something. Gabe had found a rope that had been tied to a steel bar that dropped down into the shaft. Clearly someone else had the same idea we did and had already given us a route down. I honestly didn't want to go down there. I just had a bad feeling. Gabe, already halfway down the shaft, yelled up at us, telling us to get down there. We nodded to each other and began heading down the rope. This floor was unlike the rest of the school. It felt more like a storage area, with standing water about 6 inches deep and narrow, twisting hallways leading to small rooms. There were no windows. I assumed this must be the basement. The further we walked through the basement, the more lost I felt. There was no easy way to keep track of which way we were going in the pitch black, and only cheap flashlights that barely lit up anything. I suggested we start heading back, and Gabe said no way, and this was the coolest part of the school. Not wanting to be that guy, I shut up and kept following Gabe with Rick and Jason behind me. We were leaving one of the empty rooms when we heard voices. We immediately froze, thinking it could be the cops. However, I quickly realized any voices we were hearing couldn't be coming from upstairs or outside, as there were no windows and we definitely were far enough back to where we wouldn't have been hearing voices from the floor above us. At this point, I told Gabe that something wasn't right and we needed to get out of here. He agreed and turned to head back to the shaft. We tried retracing our steps, but kept getting turned around. We all started arguing over which way to go. Then, over our arguing, we heard a terrifying, inhuman scream from deep within the basement. I say inhuman because there's no way a human could have made this sound, but it also had human characteristics as well. It's honestly the only way I can describe it. Without saying anything, we all started running in all directions trying to get out of that basement. I saw Rick turn a corner ahead of me and I followed. After what seemed like a lifetime, I turned the corner to see Jason halfway up the shaft and Rick starting to climb up right behind him. I ran to the rope to grab it and started climbing up too, but turned around and realized Gabe was not behind me. I called his name but got no response. Terrified, I yelled up at Rick and Jason that Gabe was gone. They shouted to leave him, running off. At this moment, I was feeling just about every emotion you could think of. I was angry at Rick and Jason for bailing. I was terrified of that scream and what made it. I wanted to run, but I also couldn't leave Gabe behind. Still holding onto the rope, I yelled for Gabe again. This time, I heard his scream. Without even thinking, I ran towards the direction where I heard Gabe scream. I didn't get far until I collided with something hard and fell into the murky water. I looked up at what I just ran into. It was Gabe. Without hesitation, Gabe grabbed my arm and pulled me up. He screamed for me to run, practically dragging me along with him. I finally found my balance and ran behind him. We reached the shaft. I yelled for Gabe to start climbing. I anxiously waited for him to get far enough up for me to start climbing up as well. I glanced back into the darkness. Part of me was expecting to see some monster straight out of a horror movie to be running at me, but I saw nothing. Not wanting to find out, I started pulling myself up the rope. I climbed as fast as I could, expecting something to grab me at any moment. I was only a few feet away from the elevator door. Gabe was there, stretching his arm out for me to grab. I took his hand and pulled myself up. As I lifted myself out of the shaft, I took one last look at the bottom. To my horror, there was what looked to be an old woman staring back at me. Her head was turned in an impossible way, looking at me. I could only see her face as the rest of her body was covered by the wall. She looked like a zombie, her skin peeling and creepy smile that was on her face. I screamed and pulled myself the rest of the way up, and quickly climbing out of the window we used to get in. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. When we got there, we saw Rick and Jason leaning against the car. I screamed at both of them for leaving us. They tried apologizing, but I was so angry I just kept yelling at them. Rick then walked past me and went to Gabe, who was sitting on the ground with his hands in his face. I stopped yelling and walked over to Gabe. I asked him what had happened when he disappeared. This was the first time we actually were able to talk about what had just happened. He said when we all heard the scream, we all started running. He said he was right behind me when it felt like something had grabbed his leg, causing him to fall. He said he then crawled into a room to hide. He then saw a woman's face peeking into the room at him from outside the hallway. This is when I heard him scream. He said when he did this, the woman's face literally disappeared into thin air, and then he took the opportunity to run back to the shaft. Shortly after this was when we collided into each other. I told him that I had also saw a woman right before I got out of the shaft. Gabe looked up at me and asked me what she looked like. When I described the woman I saw, Gabe started crying, the only time that I ever saw Gabe cry. He said it was exactly the same thing he saw. We then got into my car and sped off, not looking back. We never talked about it again. To this day, I still don't know what it was I saw, but the image of that woman's face peering up for me at the bottom of that shaft still gives me nightmares to this day.